Hi everyone, welcome back to the Reinventing Real Estate podcast. We are really excited today to be joined by James Whidborne, Head of Living at Edmond de Rothschild. And we're really excited because they're real pioneers in affordable housing and urban regeneration with a history that stretches all the way back to the 1890s. So James, thanks so much for joining us. So James, I guess people tend to kind of start at your professional journey, but we'd love to learn more about you as a person. So I think we should go kind of right back to the very beginning. I mean, what did you think you were going to do? What did you want to do when you grew up? What was your kind of aspiration?
I think like lots of people in our sector, I'm a frustrated architect. So when I was about 14, I had a drawing board and I was determined to be an architect. And then I actually went to do work experience as an architect and realised maybe that's not for me. And then went completely in a different direction and did an undergrad degree in environmental science. Then graduated and thought, actually, I need to earn a living, and real estate felt like moving into real estate in an investment context felt like the sort of second best to being an architect. But it's that kind of creative development side of real estate that's always been deep rooted in my DNA, I guess.
It always baffles me when you go and, you sort of sell a site or project, and then in 3 years' time you go there and it's all built and you can see the thing. And I think property people are so tangible, aren't they? They just love seeing the design and being in the buildings and experiencing it, I think.
That's right, yeah. And it's the thing that always gets, whenever you interview someone in real estate, it's a consistent theme of applicants. It's always that tangible, real side of property, which is, it just makes it stand out from the other investment classes ultimately.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I suppose what at the beginning, obviously being able to use that creative, but applying it in a different way is something that appealed to you. But what else kind of excited you about getting into the sector?
Well, I guess drilling down into living specifically, I'd love to say I've ended up in living through a very clever career path that I decided 20 years ago. But like a lot of things in life, it happens by chance. But my first job out of university was with a guy called Philip Hillman, with a firm that was called King Sturge, is now part of JLL. But he was at the time one of two teams doing student sector. And at the time I was the guy who got the coffee and the bacon sandwiches, and my career has kind of led from there really ultimately. So it's chance that I'm in the living sector, but what I love about the living sector is everybody has a innate connection with it. We all live in residential buildings, we all have an opinion, and we can all relate to it.
I think with living it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think the vast majority of people you speak to have somehow fallen into it by accident, especially students somehow. I think student was that catalyst, and then everything's sort of gone off from there. So.
Well, what's interesting for me is as I say, I was a graduate 20 years ago, and 20 years ago there was very much a snob factor. If you worked in the residential sector, you were seen as almost a second-class citizen amongst the graduates, and the really glamorous guys were doing the big office deals and working in the city.
Who's laughing now?
And there was definitely a kind of almost a stigma attached to working in the residential side. And what the student sector did for residential generally is create a product that was investable at scale, which until then hadn't really happened in the residential sector. And it was almost, in the early days of student, we didn't quite know where to put it because it wasn't really exposure to the residential sector, nor was it a commercial investment. But what it did do, and I think what's been underestimated about it, is produce this fantastic granular income stream which capital markets can then carve up in lots of different ways, and it can appeal to all sorts of varieties of types of capital, and that's why it's been the success that it has ultimately.
What was the vibe like in those days of like the student sector, and was it sort of exciting and energetic, or was it quite slow as a starter and then ramped up?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite frustrating sometimes because we all bought into it and were fully spent, the early part of my career anyway is trying to convince investors this is the right thing to do, this is absolutely what we should be doing. And interestingly, the sector was actually on the brink of, I wouldn't say collapse, that was pretty catastrophic, but post GFC, there was a time when the likes of Liberty Living and Brando were having genuine financial issues, and Opal was an operator developer that went into administration. And before the sector had really got a chance to become what it is today, it nearly disappeared altogether. But just at that time, a lot of quite aggressive and opportunistic American capital came over, and platforms have emerged since, whether it's Red Letter, whether it's Oaktree's student platform, Knightsbridge, I think it was called. Yeah. And they kind of ultimately rescued the sector from what was quite a precarious situation. So, but there was a good 10 years when we were, the sort of weird team in the corner that did the student, and then it's kind of grown from there. So it's been quite exciting.
There's some kind of nice parallels there, I think, as well, to co-living and the journey of that, I'd say now or 2 years ago, in terms of what you're referring to, in terms of that education, and that, you guys really believed in it, but getting other people to kind of get on board with that use class and having to kind of educate about the merits, and then seeing it really kind of, take off.
Well, co-living is interesting because we all feel like it's a new sector, but actually when I was a graduate, there was grad pads, they were called then, and there was also hostels, and ultimately co-living is somewhere between a hostel and an apartment block. It's just, the concept of a grad pad was emerging pre-GFC, and then I think as a result of GFC it never got to the momentum that it's now benefiting from. But both co-living and the student sector are both solutions to a problem which is very relevant today, which is building residential at a cost which delivers a sensible income return is very, very difficult to do, and co-living and student are an intense use of the same built volume and built form, which drives ultimately a higher income return from that same built volume. And that was a problem that existed 20 years ago, and we're now back to that same set of dynamics. And key worker housing as well, which was the forefather to the student sector. Unite, obviously one of the biggest student operators in the UK, were originally a key worker housing platform. And they rotated into the student sector.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
Not very commonly known, is it?
No, I mean, that was a long, long time ago, but probably 25 years ago. But certainly their early schemes were for nurses and key workers.
Wow. And then in terms of, I suppose it's amazing to get to a point where people can only, see your successes and think that the journey was smooth, but it'd be lovely to kind of hear some key lessons or experience that you've had that really shaped your approach today, and any kind of tough lessons you learnt along the way but ultimately resulted in the greater good. Or
I think I have to say, having had a career which started pre-GFC, so 2004 was when I started work, I guess. And the years running up to GFC were crazy. The weight of money wanting to get into real estate in the UK was extraordinary. And when I started at what was Cordia Savills, now Savills Investment Management, I think in my first year there as a graduate, I think the platform launched 8 funds or something. I mean, it was just unbelievable. So to go from that kind of an environment to then a period post GFC where it was, dead ultimately. There was nothing going on at all. It was pretty extraordinary. And then I think some of the decisions we made, because at the time you're kind of, as a young guy, you're looking around the floor hoping that the senior guys in the team know the answers, but ultimately no one had gone through that kind of complete turning off of the tap that we went through post GFC. And I think if I look back, we made some decisions then which were a bit of a knee-jerk, almost panic decision, that actually if we just held our nerve and rode out, we would have been, so that the student hall fund that I was looking after at the time, ultimately to remedy and service some defaults on debt facilities at the time, we ended up selling probably our best asset. And I think if we'd have held on to that asset, we would have carried on being the best performing fund in the sector, and that would have been an enormous platform to grow from. But as it was, we were slightly forced to sell one of our best assets, and that I think what that taught me was actually, as a borrower, sometimes you have a stronger position than you think, and it can be better to hold your nerve and negotiate rather than just perhaps pander to a lender's needs and wants.
That is interesting, because I think over the past few years people have obviously been caught out a little bit with some of the increases in interest rates and off low bars, but have had productive conversations with the banks, and the banks seem to have, in the most part, been a bit more accommodating than they have been historically to the sector. And now, I mean, we have so many different conversations with student developers and owners where debt's being offered at very competitive levels now, which is great and great for the marketplace. But yeah, it is interesting to see how that dynamic is similar but also very different now.
Yeah, and I guess when a market loses all liquidity, and obviously your best assets are the ones that are the most liquid, but they're exactly the assets that pull you out of when you see a trough in performance and you have a nosedive in performance. It's those assets which will be the first to recover, and we'll be the first ones to bring that performance back. So it's a paradox which I guess is impossible to solve, but it boils down to relationships and experience, I guess. And I suppose, whereas when I was a graduate in 2008, you would look around the floor and there weren't many people who had experienced that. At least now there's a whole generation of people who have been through that and kind of know and understand it. And that works from the lender's perspective as well. They equally, there were lots of people from the lenders who hadn't been through that and didn't know how to cope. So that was an interesting time. And then I guess in terms of other lessons learnt, I think it's often a misnomer to think that just because you've got a fixed build cost or fixed price build contract, ultimately a building will cost what it costs to build. There aren't many contractors who you can enter a fixed price build contract with a blue chip contractor or a tier one contractor, but if ultimately the cost to deliver that contract is going to result in them losing money, they will battle hand over fist to make sure that doesn't happen. So your contract is obviously worth, having a solid contract is obviously sensible, and you need to do it, but you need to recognise that if you go through a period of huge build cost inflation, you as the owner of that building is not going to be completely immune to what happens there, and that can manifest in terms of contractor dragging their heels, delaying construction, trying to get you back to the negotiating table to try and get them back some profit margin, etc. So you just need to be live to that when you go into.
It is a great point, because I think a lot of people
project
with forward fundings and that type of thing almost take for granted, or had historically taken for granted, that a fixed price build contract was totally fixed.
Well, I think the reality is you pay an enormous premium for that. So yes, you can obviously get a completely watertight fixed build contract, and you can get that with a counterparty that's so huge that they will definitely ride it out and you're fine. But you will pay a big premium up front for that. So you get there in the end one way or another. You're building, you are exposed to those inflationary pressures in the construction market.
What is the best piece of advice you think you've ever been given? And that can be personal or at work.
Wow. Best piece of advice. So I should say something really clever. I'll come back to that one. I'll think one.
Or even like something, advice that you would give, having been on the journey that you've been on.
I think I would definitely say to people looking at careers now, I think you need to enjoy what you do, and this is a bit of a cliche, but it's definitely true. Like, there will be really tough times in your career where, unless you enjoy the people you work with and what you're doing, you will have a pretty miserable time. And that is, you can't, I think, to pursue something purely for remuneration or for short-term gains is not a very sensible strategy. I think you've got to, there has to be more to it than that. And that, I think we're all learning that in terms of the importance of having an office and having, working together in an office and not working from home and all these sorts of things. We're kind of starting to understand more, I think, the importance of that and the intangibles of having a team and those kind of softer aspects to work life, which, I think there is more to work than just getting paid at the end of the day, and that's pretty important.
I think as a society, we've almost been like pushed away from that passion and, do something you love, and ultimately like success will follow. Now it's much more, what you're kind of taught via social media and things like that is that, win big and win quick, which just isn't reality, and also isn't gratifying. It's not, that kind of graft and that really like honing in on your craft and growing and going through the ranks, and that is kind of seen now as more like old school mentality. But you're right, it's absolutely the crux of doing something you love is so important.
And this is the pearl of wisdom I was trying to recall, but someone said to me, if you do something you enjoy, you will naturally be good at it, and if you're really good at it, someone will pay you to do it ultimately. And I think it's as simple as that.
So true.
Unfortunately, no one paid me to play golf or cricket.
That's a shame.
Maybe one
There's
day.
still time. There's still time. Don't give up. Don't give up on the dream.
I'm still going to do it. Yeah.
So, in terms of sort of like identifying, if you're sort of thinking about your investment strategies and looking at how EDR has really pioneered its way in affordable housing and the BTR sector, amongst obviously vast amounts of other things, but how do you kind of go about identifying those thematic uses that you want to really spend your time on and deploy capital into? Or is it just sort of opportunistic and then one thing leads on to another and then it becomes part of a broader strategy?
Well, I mean, our strategy at EDR is obviously what we call mid-market housing and affordable housing, and that I can't take credit for the reason we've pursued that theme, but my colleagues, particularly my colleague John Partridge, who actually was my chairman at my previous job at Cordia Savills and then Savills Investment Management, that's been a theme which he has been pushing for 20 plus years. So what we're doing now is the culmination of 20 plus years of his hard work. And back to our conversation about the early days of the student sector, it has been an uphill battle to convince investors that it's the right thing to invest in. But back to your question about how you choose a theme, I think the themes kind of choose themselves. I mean, mid-market mainstream housing is in some respects quite self-evident, and the macro drivers behind that are quite self-evident, and I guess most importantly quite easy for investors to accept and relate to and digest, because to some extent there's no point coming up with a theory or thesis that might well be true, but unless you can convince capital that it's true, it's a kind of thankless task. But you also need to choose a theme where hopefully you're not in competition with loads of other existing platforms. So it's a combination of choosing a niche or a new sector that perhaps there will always be others, but there aren't reams of others accessing that market, but one where you've got a fairly indisputable macro story behind it. And then I guess it's a case of doing the research and I think once you've come up with the macro theme, it's quite easy to backfill with research.
I mean, I think what's really interesting generally about your strategy is, like, while it obviously seems sort of obvious now, it probably wasn't obvious in those days, although it was probably obvious to you guys because you saw an opportunity and you went for it. But certainly over the past 12 months, I think investors have almost woken up to the fact that this sort of mid-market BTR, amenity-light type format is actually incredibly compelling and taps into that sort of depth of the market in a way that I feel like beforehand they sort of knew this but didn't sort of really concentrate on it in the same way.
Well, there's kind of two schools to thought, and there's either our view, which is you target the deepest demand market, and then other schools of thought which are targeting quite deliberately higher salaries because there's a bigger buffer in terms of affordability. So, and they're both perfectly rational conversations to have. A slightly more cynical way of looking at why a lot of the early movers in build to rent went for higher end is because they had to get it to work financially, and also at the time the underlying capitals and LPs weren't, if you said to a typical investor, I've got a scheme in Warrington, most of them would say, where is Warrington? And most are more interested in their exit risk and exit liquidity. Yeah. So that has channeled a lot of capital to London and Manchester initially. Birmingham's been an interesting one because that's been relatively late to the party, but there's a lot in London and Manchester, and a lot of that is to do with exit risk and liquidity risk as opposed to necessarily occupier fundamentals, because put simply, if I have to get rid of some property, I know I can get rid of it in London, whereas might not be able to in the regions. We would always say, well, if you've built a portfolio and you can evidence that income stream is repeatable and recurring and granular and performs, you actually shouldn't mind where it is, and should be geographically agnostic. But capital isn't always so perfectly rational, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose it's pretty pioneering to have gone into places like Nottingham, like Warrington, where there's clearly an amazing demand and supply story and huge opportunity there. But actually, as you say, from an exit perspective, at the time it was probably more of a risk and more of a sort of leap of faith.
Yeah, I think we felt that the income return advantage you would get was enough to compensate for that risk. We also were slightly sceptical at the rents you need to command to go to build the high value city centre schemes that you've seen in London and Manchester.
Yeah.
the other side to that story is to actually repeat what we've done is incredibly difficult.
It's almost impossible, isn't it?
And actually today, arguably, it is impossible to repeat because of what's happened to build costs. So part of the reason regional strategies in build to rent haven't been so prevalent is because it's incredibly hard to do it. We just happened to land on a point in time when the maths did work, and we built a team that was able to be a bit braver about the level of contractor you chose. I mean, we chose some tier 2 and tier 3 contractors because that's what made it economically viable. Not all platforms are able to do that, and not all capital is able to do that. And I guess the root answer to that is we are incredibly lucky that we've had a pool of investors who are patient enough and loyal enough that they've allowed us to do it. And back to my point about PBSA, a lot of the reason the PBSA sector emerged is because outside of London it was quite hard to get a rental product to be viable, because for sale yields typically have been 2.5% to 3%, which for an investor looking for an income return is just not enough. It needs to be 4, 5.5%. And that's kind of why PBSA yields have actually not really moved even over the GFC and to now. They've stayed pretty stable at around 5.5%, because that's the kind of sweet spot for an income return, and that's why most people are investing in that sector.
So James, what do you think sets your approach apart? It'd be lovely to talk about your kind of vertical integration between owning and operating assets.
Yeah, so that was a decision made 6 or so years ago, because at the time there wasn't the third party or access to third party property management that is starting to emerge now. I would say there still isn't in the UK a really sizable, credible third party operational platform, and so that was part of the reasons we went down that route. But the other reason was I think we actually genuinely feel, and we still do feel, that from a risk management perspective, actually having direct interaction with the tenants is a really important thing. And that's, anecdotes, and we've got 3,500 apartments, give or take, which is close to 5,000 people. That's a lot of scope for fires, burglaries, suicides, and you get all sorts of things in living that you just don't get in the commercial sector. If human beings can do something stupid, they will do, and I think you do need kind of immediate access and interface with boots on ground as to what's happening in your buildings, just to maintain ultimately investors' income returns and the operations of the buildings, but both to look after the real estate and keep the customers happy. I mean, that's ultimately what it's all about. It's customer retention, and if you keep customers in your building, you will drive rental growth and you will drive income return. So that's why we've gone down that vertical integration route. And it does also mean that when we're underwriting opportunities, we do have kind of privileged access to a UK-wide set of data now, and we're starting to have a much deeper understanding in terms of letting cycles, letting patterns, frankly, who lives in these buildings, because until now we'd all kind of made assumptions, and I have to say, it's sort of common sense. Most people in our buildings are in late 20s, maybe early 30s. We're starting to see some grey pound arriving in our buildings. I think that will be an increasing trend. But that then ultimately feeds into how you market the buildings, how you target those demographics. And you can also cross-sell between your buildings. So we've got quite a large Midlands weightings, and we're starting to see people moving in between buildings within the Midlands. And a degree, to some extent, of sort of brand loyalty emerging as well, which I guess is slightly new to the sector.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What, people moving between one town and another town just to maintain their
Well,
access
they might be
to-
moving for work or for other reasons, but they'll stay in it. They'll the first question they'll ask is, do you have a building in Leicester? Do you have a building in Rugby? And because we'd like to move into one of your buildings.
That's
So
incredible.
I think that will start to emerge more and more. And I would say at the time that was quite a unique proposition. I think there are more and more people going down the vertically integrated route. I think, interestingly, the PBSA sector, that's been the kind of norm from the beginning. The kind of operator developer model has been fairly standard in that sector, and quite a lot of the more entrepreneurial, certainly US capital, sees a lot of value in owning the operational brand and the operational platform. And I think a lot of the appeal to the living sector and the operational capital markets in general is that idea that you control the company within, which again is very different to if you look at the commercial real estate sectors and you have a warehouse let to Amazon or whoever it might be. Clearly, as a landlord, you've got absolutely no control or
whatsoever.
sense of how that tenant is operating or behaving. So I guess that's fairly unique to the sector. I don't know if that answers your question.
Definitely.
But,
And what have you learnt from your residents over the years? What have you kind of taken on board, perhaps changed and optimised design? Have there been, real influences there?
It's interesting. Amenity space is often a kind of hot topic, and we've obviously erred towards Amenity-light, which in a large part is in reaction to trying to get the highest yield on cost possible and trying to make the buildings as efficient as possible, but also from lessons learned in the student sector. There's lots of fantastic amenities available in the student sector, and they're often very good marketing gimmicks to marketing tools to get people to sign up to a tenancy. In reality, they don't get used really by the residents, and we are very much focused on what we describe as sustainable locations. So to our mind, if you're having to put amenities into a building, it's because you've probably bought in the wrong location in the first place. I mean, most people don't really want to watch a movie in their building. They want to go to a cinema, or they want to meet their friends in a real pub, or they want to go to a real restaurant. They don't necessarily want to live, work and play in the same building. I think there was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction post-COVID to, we need to have some home working space, or we need to increase the amenity provision. But I think as we get further, and hopefully COVID becomes a more and more distant memory, that's partly why the sort of low amenity models perhaps come back into favour.
That's a really interesting perspective, because I think most people just take the amenity elements for granted now, and it's like, well, if I'm building a BTR block, we have to include X, Y, and Z. But if the location is prime enough, and you're buying in the right locations, do you really need the amenities that people think you need? And I think that is something that the market needs to think about a lot more.
Yeah, and it goes back to, and this happened a bit in the student sector too, is the sort of, crikey, this building's cost me this much to build, or is going to cost me this much to build. What bells and whistles do I need to bolt on to kind of justify to myself that the rents I think I'm going to achieve are going to be achievable? And there's been a little bit of that going on, I think. So yeah, I think there's definitely there is. Don't want to give away too much secret sauce, but gyms. Everyone now expects a gym. I think that's like a standard issue offer now, and I think the customers expect that now. My personal take is, I think a dining room that you can hire it's just common sense that if you live in a 2-bedroom flat and you want to have a kid's birthday party, or you want to have your mates round for a dinner party or whatever it is, you just can't do that in a modern 2-bedroom flat, really. So having some sort of space that you can rent to have those kind of events is sensible. Yes, some kind of some sort of co-working, live work type space is helpful. Actually, just a quiet room where you can sit and, you know, be on a Teams call or something away from everyone else is also helpful. But yeah, in reality, I think a lot of amenities are ultimately just a bit of a marketing gimmick.
That's a nice point, isn't it? Also about encouraging people to also engage in the area and the community, not just the community of the building and the amenities within the building, and just admitting, look, if people want to go to a cinema, actually they want to go to a cinema that's kind of, you know, vibrant and it's full of people and there's that kind of atmosphere, or they want to go to a pub with an atmosphere, as opposed to, like you say, trying to kind of be the everything for everyone. I think that's a really nice point, and I suppose that's why location is so important, because in these buildings, you know, you're providing a life for people and a lifestyle, but it's not the answer to everything, and that's why location is so important.
Yeah, and I think increasingly I'm slightly worried about my kids' generation in that and you've seen this again in the student world. If you can just immerse yourself in your phone and live your life through your phone, and if you don't watch out, you just don't ever leave your studio flat or 1-bedroom flat or whatever. I just don't think that's a healthy direction for us to be heading in. Having said that, like most English people, I hate the idea of forced fun, and kind of community events would be my worst nightmare. But we do in our buildings try and curate a bit of community, for the very selfish reason that if you create a connection to the building and curate that community sense, it does ultimately make people want to stay there and feel a bit more attached to your building specifically. So
I totally agree
with that.
I think that is important. And to slightly contradict everything I've just said, what we are seeing is we've got some quite nice examples where there might be a Pilates instructor as one of our tenants, and they're using our stretch room to give Pilates lessons. Or we've had some quite interesting cultural exchanges where there might be I'm trying to think of I think we just had the Persian. I think in Persia they celebrate Easter.
Nowruz,
I think it is. Showing my ignorance, but in one of our buildings they've just held an event. So that's definitely got some value, I think, and that side of it may start to grow. But how you marry that with the sort of English resistance to forced fun, I don't quite. But
it is nice, isn't it? If you've got a Pilates instructor or someone in the building, and it sort of naturally takes form somehow, or it's offered or prompted, and then that snowballs into something that's community. I think it's a nice way to do it, to sort of utilise the skill set that's already in the community, rather than necessarily totally, bringing in, you know, lots of different things, but leveraging the residents and leveraging kind of
that is true community, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
As in, that's, in a way, that's kind of the opposite of that forced fun. It's that, you know, I'm part of this. Yeah, exactly. I'm part of this community. This is my skill. I want to share that with, you know, the friends that I've made here. And that's when, you know, I think you've been successful at community.
Yeah.
In a building.
Yeah. I think that's right. But how you do that and it not feel contrived and sort of, I guess it's the real skill which we're probably as a sector sort of going to have to learn over the next 5 or so years. But
it's probably more bottom up than it is top down. I think relying on more of the on the ground teams and the community is far better than trying to dictate it from, you know, investor level, where frankly we're not none of us, I don't think, are community creators and events creators.
No, and that
fun,
is
though.
one thing that is definitely, the UK is terrible at the service industry anyway. But one thing we definitely need to get better at as a sector and a living sector is recognising that a decent site manager who is responsible for that building can make or break a building, and they will, a good site manager will genuinely have a relationship with all the tenants, and it will be as I say, a genuine relationship where he's genuinely interested in what they're doing, he knows their names, and he is able to organically create that sense of community and loyalty. And that, I think, is a skill set which we need to try and develop and nurture somehow, because that will, whether you're a student building or whether you're a BTR building, a good site manager can make or break a building.
I think it's definitely worth talking about that, because I think over the past few years, obviously with costs going up, there's been such a big focus on how do we reduce costs, how do we pay people, competitive salaries, how do we get these on-site managers to potentially do more. But actually, as you say, if you are getting a really good on-site manager and maybe you pay a little bit more for that privilege, or
it's a
you
total
take
false
people,
economy to not reward them.
And then you're going to get more loyalty and more rents and more stickiness if you have a really high quality person who's understanding the community and as you say, sort of knows those people within the building.
Yeah, but the challenge is there's a bit of a war for talent going on at the moment between the BTR sector and the student sector, and that that I mean, there's not enough. There's not a workforce in the UK, full stop. But particularly in the kind of service industry, there's a big shortage.
Yeah.
That's an interesting dynamic.
So if we look at the sort of wider living sectors, so we've talked a little bit about affordable housing, but we've talked more about sort of mid-market BTR. What's your thought process? And clearly you've come from the student sector, and co-living is now a sort of emerging and coming into a merged sector in a lot of ways. But what's your sort of internal strategy or house view on some of these other uses? And is there a way forward with EDR, with student or with co-living, or something in between?
I think we actually see, we don't really differentiate between BTR, co-living, or even PBSA to some extent. We kind of see them as variations of multifamily living. So I think we will, where appropriate, consider PBSA or co-living. I don't think we see them necessarily as subsectors in their own right. I think there's a worry again, back to the reason ultimately co-living has emerged as an asset class is because it was somewhere between student and residential. Often it meant you didn't have to provide affordable housing. It was a more intense use of that built volume. So it was a solution to a viability problem. I think everyone recognises that everyone would rather live in a traditional 2-bedroom flat, but that may not just be viable or realistic. So I don't think we really necessarily distinguish between multifamily, co-living and PBSA. They're just different architectural solutions to deliver housing, ultimately multifamily housing. Whether by other sectors, single family housing, I think we clearly understand the depth of demand for a single family housing product from an occupational perspective. Again, clearly, if everyone was given a choice, they'd all love to live in a 3-bedroom detached house rather than a studio flat. And we understand that single family caters for a much broader demographic, from children all the way through to retired elderly couples can be housed in single family. But I think that challenge we have with single family is, particularly in the UK, ultimately, and this is from my experience of the strategic land market, most, if not all, of the suburban strategic land in the UK is controlled by 3 or 4 house builders in one way, shape or form. And that creates some challenges when you want to deploy institutional scale capital. There's a very slow deployment rate in single family. It takes you a long time to roll out meaningful chunks of, whereas a multifamily building might be somewhere between 20 and 100 million pounds in one ticket. That's quite easy to think, okay, I've parked that money, good, it's going to get me a return, fantastic. If you were to park the same amount of money into single family, it might take you 2 years, 3 years to actually deploy that capital, and then it might take you another 2-3 years to fill the building and fill the buildings and start getting rent from them. So that is a bit of a challenge, and I don't know the answer to solve that problem. But clearly, I recognise that within the residential sector, from an occupier's perspective, single family has definitely got its place. But I don't think it's something that we're going to do as a house necessarily. We might do as part of a strategy, but it won't be a dedicated single family strategy. And then age restricted housing. We do actually, within our regulated affordable housing fund, have some age restricted housing. I think there's quite a few specialist players in that space, and capital has quite a lot of opportunities to access specialist age restricted housing providers. So again, it might be part of a strategy, but I'd be surprised if we did a dedicated.
Yeah. I think what you said was actually really, really interesting, because it seems like these 3 sectors, or the sort of broader residential living sectors, have blended, but blended only in the last sort of 12 months. And before that, it felt like people were very much, funds were very much specific around, okay, I want to do BTR, I want to do student, or I want to pursue a co-living strategy. But I feel like what we're now seeing, especially from some of the US entrants and some of the sort of more larger scale platforms, is that definition of one use class is blending very much into, okay, actually we're sort of seeing this all in a very similar light. Like you were saying, it's a building, it's maybe operated in a slightly different way, but it is residential, whether that's PBSA, co-living, or BTR, or something in between. So it does seem to be that, the market is, in the last few months, maturing and looking at different opportunities in the same type of vehicle. I don't know if you're finding that as well.
I think I can imagine PBSA always sitting separate, because the occupier drivers are different to the kind of wider, more macro demographic drivers that you see in build to rent or multifamily and single family. But yeah, I think I personally can't ever see co-living becoming a sector in itself necessarily, because previously you had hotels and you had serviced apartments, and then I guess co-living sits somewhere between serviced apartments and build to rent. I suppose it boils down to probably the tenancy length, and a serviced apartment, you might be only there for a week, a few days, whereas I think maybe if co-living starts to drift into shorter and shorter tenancies and becomes much closer to almost a hotel type model, then that is a different offering to multifamily build to rent, I think, and probably driven by different fundamentals. But if you're still talking about 6 to 12 month tenancies, I don't see a differentiator. And I think the capital markets will probably, as you say, see the two as variations on a theme ultimately.
Perhaps for different demographics, though, I suppose, in the sense of there are certain demographics you can have in multifamily that you can't have in co-living. Children, families.
Yeah,
you know,
that's
it's more
right.
that kind of single. It's almost it's a product for a different demographic, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think co-living feels to me it's always going to be a sort of stopping point for someone until they find a kind of real home, if you like, or somewhere that they might want to stay longer term. I can't believe it's going to be something that's someone's going to live in for many years. Therefore, I think it's always going to appeal to that early 20s.
There is some nice data though emerging around co-living in terms of like length of stay, but also older people using it as kind of like pied-à-terres, or older people not wanting, like they find themselves alone but don't want to go into a building that only has older people and still want that kind of vibrancy and community.
I think that's right. I mean, and that's where I get a little bit nervous when people start talking about age restricted housing, because I think should we be making older people live in communes that
It's strange.
Actually, you're better to all be, if you build decent housing, that should cater for the full gambit of demographics, and it should be a nice place for everyone to live in.
And that emulates real communities as well, right? In
Exactly,
the sense of, on a street, you would have the older couple and then the younger couple that have just moved in, and they sometimes come round on the odd occasion, look after your kids, or that's, I think, what's so lovely about having a variety of different people in the buildings, because they're all there for kind of different reasons and can help each other out, and that's when you form that genuine community, as opposed to it becoming, like you say, a kind of Truman Show.
Yeah, I mean, we do curate that mix of demographics. We within our build to rent schemes, we proactively limit the number of students, because not because we don't want students in our buildings, but we do want to make sure we get stable mixed communities, because ultimately they stay longer, you get better tenant retention, you get a more stable income stream. So I think that's where, I suppose that's right. That's where co-living is slightly different, maybe.
I think moving on in terms of what we normally talk about in the podcast is innovation and what is next for the property market, and what are the trends that we should essentially be bracing for over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. If we're thinking about that, what's your thoughts on those kind of trends and what we're going to be seeing and what we should all be getting ready to do, really?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, what has happened as a byproduct of the internet and, a direct byproduct of the internet is obviously a lot of real estate has become increasingly obsolete, and I think our sector's probably a bit. The US is always a bit quicker to recognise these things and reacts a little bit quicker. In the UK, we're always a bit slower. I think there is a lot more real estate in the UK that is truly obsolete than we'd all like to admit. So I think the next 10 years is going to be all about repositioning. When you look at also what's happened to ground up development and how expensive that's become, I think we'll see an enormous amount of repositioning of existing real estate. There's interesting work being done converting multi-storey car parks into blocks of flats. Obviously, office conversions are not so straightforward, but hopefully we'll come up with some intelligent solutions to that. In terms of sort of trends of growth, I do actually think the high streets will probably have a bit of a resurgence, because that is ultimately a leisure activity for a lot of people. And I think the high streets have been kind of forgotten about a bit. Obviously, it's all going to be about living. Everyone's going to want residential exposure. I think from a low base, I think the high streets could see a bit of resurgence just from a kind of leisure aspect. It is ultimately, it has been throughout time, humans have liked convening in marketplaces for a social activity, and I think it's very sad what has happened to the high streets in the UK. And I actually think there's a very quick and simple solution to that local authorities, what they charge in business rates to retailers just makes it almost impossible to make that work. And I think with some sensible concessions, they could bring some life back to high street retail. So that's what I'd like to see. My sentimental wish, I guess, and I hope that will happen. I worry a bit that with the obsession about the internet that we all focus on data centers and things. I think there's a quite significant binary risk with data centers because the capital values are so enormous in that sector and the rents are so enormous that they don't really reflect real estate fundamentals. And I'm by no means clever enough to really understand what the future of the internet and the long-term need for data centers really is. You've got Microsoft working out that you can put a data center out in the sea.
Oh, wow.
And various things like that. So you could see a situation where suddenly these enormously expensive data centers are just not worth anything.
You could have a hovering data center.
And the sort of shopping centres of the future, I suppose, in terms of obsolescence. But in the same way, I hope High Street comes back. I think shopping centres will also see a bit of a resurgence. It become probably much more leisure focused or mixed use. So that's going to be interesting. But I think we'll all have to become specialists in repurposing real estate over the next 10 years.
Operational in different ways, isn't it? And as you say, with the leisure side of things, actually having events and having leisure as part of shopping centres and it becoming much more about a destination to go to and enjoy and have fun rather than it being just for shopping is pretty compelling. And I think we're actually seeing some really positive stories coming out of these shopping centres that have pivoted to, bringing in the community in the same way that in the sectors that we operate in, it's about engaging with the community and creating a community in your building. These shopping centres, I suppose, have been forced to reach out to the community and engage in a way that they maybe didn't before.
Yeah. I think, and there's, as I say, ultimately human beings have wanted to convene in public places where that's kind of hardwired into our being. So I think that we will start to see a lot more of that, those kind of uses. And
also, when you look kind of further afield, I think it's really interesting, and the great thing about kind of overseas influencers, but if you see about how somewhere like Dubai, given obviously they have a lot more land, but the way that they have interpreted kind of shopping centres and all the way from ski slopes and everything is like fully integrated because they're so used to, I suppose, inside living because of extreme weather conditions. But that's quite interesting as well, just look at how different kind of emerging places are really interpreting those fully integrated shopping centres whereby you can go and eat, shop, ski even, go to the cinema, all those things in one place.
Yeah, and I guess the joy of Dubai and Saudi Arabia, they've got a completely blank canvas and they can kind of rewrite the rules of architecture and start from scratch and So I mean, it's amazing what you look at. The sort of projects they're undertaking in Saudi Arabia are completely. They look like something out of Dune. They're completely,
It's like AI. It feels like
are.
they're like AI generated. Yeah.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
really exciting. Sadly, the UK is always slightly confined in what it can do because, as you say, you just can't put together those kind of land parcels and have that kind of freedom of architecture. But personally, I'm come from a farming background, so I like being outside, and the idea of being that Dubai living where you go from your air conditioned office to your air conditioned car to your air conditioned. I couldn't
Not for you.
cope with that.
No.
And actually, what my kind of long term thesis is that I think the UK will be a huge beneficiary from climate driven migration. So where you've got a world where birth rates are declining and ultimately at some point the world's population will start declining, I think the UK is very well positioned to be a beneficiary and continue to benefit from net immigration because our climate will suddenly become quite attractive, having we've all spent years desperately trying to get away from our climate, but I think it will become increasingly attractive. And we've seen people from the Middle East coming to London to get out away from the heat for decades now, and I think that will become increasingly an increasing theme for other countries.
We're already seeing, aren't we, sort of holidays, people who had previously gone to Greece and Portugal and Spain and Italy actually now considering going to the Nordics instead for their summer trips because they just can't bear the heat anymore, the heat waves that we've seen. So actually the impact on real estate and the impact on building new resorts or building hotels or services, and that could have a major impact on the UK market and maybe revive some of these seaside towns that were previously in decline.
Well, yeah, I mean, so we go to Whitby a lot on our family holidays, and Whitby is sort of was a Victorian holiday destination, and it's seeing a huge resurgence at the moment, exactly that, and it's fascinating to watch. We've been going there for nearly 20 years now, I guess, and suddenly nice coffee shops pop up, and we can get fantastic Michelin star food now and things like that, which 10 years ago there's absolutely no chance. But
you get a matcha latte down there at Whitby?
I haven't tried that yet, but maybe. I'm sure I can. I'll try hard.
Almond milk.
That's the real litmus test, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm pretty confident. I'll let you know, Jamie.
Yeah, do please.
What's in your roadmap for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I'm very, very lucky that I have spent my career in I guess one of two sectors which is here to stay, and I think we'll sort of probably increasingly benefit from reallocations towards it. So I don't see myself moving out of the living sector over the next 10 years, and I very hope it's kind of more of the same, really, and I'm hoping that there's kind of an ever-growing momentum towards what I've been doing for my career. So obviously global domination is within my reach in the next 5 years, but
love it.
Why not?
I've never done anything in Europe. I'd quite like to do something in Europe, but I'm by no means qualified. I'm a terrible linguist, but it would be nice to take my UK living experience and do something overseas. That would be interesting, entertaining. But ultimately, I suspect, without wanting to sound too boring, it'll be more of the same, I hope, and bigger and better, and keep going. The kind of sky's the limit, really. I mean, that is the scary thing about the living sector, is when you stand back and think of the scale of it by comparison to what we now consider to be, the institutional real estate investment sector. Just in very simple terms, if you buy into the idea that people are moving away from home ownership and moving towards rental, and if you buy into the idea that that rental property will be owned by institutional investors, you've only got to look out the window and see the volume of real estate which is residential versus the volume of real estate that's commercial to realise that the living sector will dwarf what is currently the commercial sector. And the commercial sector, again, in 10 years' time, it wouldn't surprise me if the guys who specialise in alternative will be the guys who do office, retail, and others.
Yeah.
And actually mainstream will be residential, because, as I say, it's just kind of common sense in terms of the built volume of the UK, which caters towards housing, versus the built volume which caters towards commercial. It's just enormous.
I think what's really interesting on that point now is that we're seeing some of the operators of residential buildings actually starting to be asked to be tackling the office sector, because rather than just letting things on lease, I feel like the office sector in some ways, or sort of certainly regionally and in different creative areas, is starting to be a lot more operational, is starting to engage with different startups, different businesses, offer services, offer events, offer community elements to it. So actually the co-working and office sector is sort of blending in some ways to the residential experience, and maybe some of the operators will continue to do that, and we'll start seeing much more overlap between office and residential.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting point that I think, gone are the days when, you thought a 20-year lease to an office or a tenant in an office building was considered secure income, and you had your 5-yearly rent reviews and upward only, and it was, that was your kind of institutional income stream. There's now a recognition that building is ultimately only worth what the occupier, or the desirability of that building from an occupier's perspective. So what I mean by that is, there's no point having a long lease on a building if it's ultimately over-rented, or fundamentally that building is not what people want anymore. So there's now a recognition that having a long lease is great, but actually what's better is really intensively operating and managing that building. And you might have higher turnover of tenants, but as long as you maintain and manage that and make sure your building remains current and relevant to the demands of the time, that is a much more secure, ultimately a secure income stream than as I say, having a building where the real estate fundamentals have become obsolete, but you might have 10 years left on a lease. But if ultimately that tenant doesn't want to be in that building, that's not a great position to be in.
Or you could get a tenant who 20 years ago could have been a fantastic covenant and quickly becomes not so fantastic either.
Yeah, and I've in a past life we've had a supermarket that was let to a well-known supermarket operator for 25 years, but in the 10th year they decided, actually, we just don't want to operate in that supermarket, and that supermarket was empty. So great, you're collecting rent for the next 15 years, but if that occupier doesn't even want to be in that building, and it's so bad that they're happy to accept the loss of paying you rent for 15 years, that means your real estate is not great. So and I think the investment world is realising that old-fashioned model is just not the best way to go about it, basically. And I think that's been helped as well with technology. So 20 years ago, the idea of managing, as I say, we've got potentially 5,000 tenants. The idea of managing 5,000 tenants 20 years ago on an Excel spreadsheet was just an absolute nightmare. Whereas now, the technology's there that it's just that much more deliverable and possible. So therefore, what you really want to do as an investor is go for the most granular income stream you possibly can, because that sort of multi-let, diverse portfolio, which living ultimately gives you, is ultimately over the long term the most secure income stream you can get.
Agreed.
Also, I think what's so nice about having, operational real estate with residents is you're constantly getting that feed. You're getting that feedback constantly, and you're able to optimize constantly.
Nowhere to hide as well.
Exactly.
You've got to
you never
stay
get to
current,
that point where everyone in the building is going to turn around to you and say, actually, we're all right, like we're going to move somewhere else, because you're constantly optimizing how you operate to get the best possible, and listening to your residents to get the best possible product for them.
And you don't get the dilapidations that you get in other sectors, because you're when a tenant leaves our building, you go in and you redecorate and you repaint, and you can lay that cost onto your tenant. So it's not a cost to you, but it means your building is always fresh and looks essentially new, which is
and you're doing it bit by bit, which is the most important part. It's not you're doing the whole building all at once. It's sort of bit by bit, if you're managing it effectively and doing that life cycle.
One of the things I worry about single family, and again it's kind of common sense I guess, but in multifamily you've only got one roof and potentially 400 tenants. Single family you might have 400 roofs and 400 tenants.
Good point.
Which is a big capex liability, which I don't think we yet as a sector really know how to. You've got 400 sets of gutters, you've got 400 sets of windows.
Yeah.
Whereas we've got one set of gutters and one, and that's quite important.
400 gardens as well.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
And roads, because if these are private estates, they're pavements, roads, plants.
Yeah, and that's back to the sort of amenity-light versus when you look at your ratio of income producing real estate versus non-income producing real estate. Clearly, if you can keep that as low as possible, or as high as possible, whichever way you want to look at it, that's got to be better from a kind of net to gross operational perspective. So exactly to your point, if you're looking at a large single family housing estate, your ratio of income producing floor area versus non-income producing floor area is obviously huge, and that's not a great place to be.
So James, one thing we love to ask our guests to draw the podcast to an end is, if you could reinvent one thing about the real estate sector, what would it be?
I think with specific to UK real estate, I think if we look at what happens in the US market, they react much more quickly to movements or trends in the capital markets than we do in the UK. We're often quite slow to reprice our assets and rebase values, and the byproduct of that is it becomes very hard to reposition real estate and repurpose it. And I think we're probably entering quite a frustrating stage in the UK market, in that there's a lot of ultimately obsolete real estate, or real estate which is definitely going to become obsolete, where because of the way that real estate's held, whether it's through private vehicles or by insurance companies or other large pension funds, there's a reticence to really hit those values, which is ultimately required to make repurposing viable and make the business case for repurposing viable. So I don't know what the answer to this is, but I think we need to, as a sector, get braver to recognise when things are not worth what they perhaps are on paper. I think that's what we need to get better at.
Brilliant. Fantastic answer. James, thank you so much for joining
so
us.
Much. Really appreciate it.
It's been incredibly interesting, and we know that our listeners are going to love all your insights and hearing about your kind of personal journey and bits of advice. And thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Reinventing Real Estate podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Looking forward to seeing you next time.